My dear, when my daughter walked down the aisle radiant and restless all at once, I never imagined the day would end with such a chill between us. A mother dreams of dancing in her daughter's joy, not standing silent under the weight of words that cut deeper than any absence ever could. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was the quiet truth I'd been carrying since her father passed. 40 million reasons to resent me, and not a single one spoken aloud. If you enjoy stories like these, I'd be mighty grateful if you'd subscribe, give it a like, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Sometimes it helps knowing who's out there sharing the silence. Now let me take you back to where it all started. She didn't even look at me when she said it. Thanks for nothing, Mother. The string quartet played on behind her like nothing had happened, Mendelssohn's lilting notes rising over a garden full of roses and rented joy. Champagne flutes clinked, laughter bubbled around us, and she walked off in her ivory heels, veil dragging like a tattered flag behind her. No one else seemed to notice the war quietly declared between us. I stood there, hand still outstretched from offering her the heirloom bracelet, the one her grandmother had worn at her own wedding, and I at mine. She hadn't even seen it. She hadn't wanted to see it. The last time her father looked at me, his fingers were cold, but his eyes were full of trust. Do what's right, he whispered. That was 2 years ago. And now I stood in the golden dusk of my daughter's wedding day, wondering if keeping my silence had been the right kind of mercy, or just cowardice in pearls. Because the truth, my dear, is that I didn't come to her wedding empty-handed. I came bearing everything. And I left with less than nothing. It was the roses that brought it all rushing back. I'd gone out early that morning, as I often do, to prune the zephyrine drowhens along the back fence. Their pink blossoms always reminded me of my mother, tender, thorny, and strong as southern summer. But that day my shears paused midair when I saw a single bloom bent to the ground, too heavy with rain. It made me think of her veil, of how it dragged through the mud at the edge of the tent after she turned her back on me, of how I stood frozen like an old statue they forgot to move out of the way before the photographs. It's been 6 months since Lydia's wedding, 6 months since she last called, 6 months since I sat in the back pew of my own silence, nursing a grief that had nothing to do with death. Her father, Thomas, would have known what to do. Or maybe not. He was always so sure of other people and so unsure of himself. But he trusted me, enough to leave everything in my name. The house, the land, the stocks, the surprise mineral rights deal he'd negotiated before the cancer returned. $40 million by the time the estate settled, most of which Lydia doesn't even know exists. Not because I meant to keep it from her, but because grief has a strange way of closing doors before you realize you're holding the key. There's more to this story than money. So much more. There's what we lost, what we chose, and what we carried. And there's what happens when a daughter sees her mother only through the lens of what she didn't say. Charleston in June has a way of pressing itself into your skin. The heat, the history, the hush of Spanish moss swaying like ghosts from the oaks. That summer, the air hung heavy not just with humidity, but with unspoken things. Secrets. Sorrow. And a daughter growing distant by degrees. Lydia wasn't always like this. There was a time she clung to my leg in the grocery store, asking if dinosaurs ate watermelon. A time she'd run barefoot across the marsh just to bring me a half-crushed bouquet of Queen Anne's lace. She was all knees and questions back then. Her father's spark, my quiet. Bright as a lighthouse and just as hard to reach once the fog rolled in. She was our only child. Not by choice but by mercy. After 3 miscarriages and 1 long night I don't care to relive, the doctor gently told me to stop trying. Thomas held my hand the whole drive home. "One daughter," he said, with the kind of conviction only fathers can afford. "She'll be enough." And she was for a long time. Thomas was a land developer, the kind who actually cared about the land. He built responsibly even when it meant less profit. Folks in town respected him, not just for his success, but for how he carried it. He didn't wear Rolexes or drive European nonsense. He had one good truck, a clean conscience, and a half-decent singing voice on Sunday mornings. I loved him from the moment he asked if he could walk me home in the rain, and I never stopped. When Lydia turned 17, he took her to see the property he was most proud of, 40 acres along the Edisto River that he refused to sell. "This," he told her, "is what it means to keep something in the family." She rolled her eyes, of course, but she remembered. I know she did. We weren't perfect. But we were close. It started to shift after college. Lydia went off to Georgetown, found herself drawn to bright cities and brighter people. She met Daniel there. Clean-cut, clever, career-minded. He had a smile like a campaign poster and a handshake like he was always interviewing. I never quite warmed to him, though I tried. When Thomas got sick the second time, Lydia visited less and less. Work's a nightmare, she'd say. Or, Daniel's up for partner, I can't leave right now. And I understood. Or tried to. But Thomas noticed. Toward the end, he stopped asking when she was coming. He left everything in my hands, not out of mistrust, but protection. She'll resent you either way, he said, voice thin as the sheet tucked under his chin. So make sure you do what's right, not what's easy. The will was clear. 40 million split in staggered trusts, but only after age 35, unless I deemed it necessary sooner. At the time, Lydia was 31. Still young. Still rushing toward something invisible. When I told her about the trust arrangement, she just stared at me like I'd slapped her. So you don't trust me, she said. You think I'd blow it all on designer furniture and fertility treatments. I didn't say that. I whispered. But by then she'd already packed her things. She didn't speak to me for 6 months. Until the wedding planning began. That's when the calls returned. Clipped, transactional, full of flower arrangements and seating charts. I offered to help, of course. Financially, emotionally, whatever she needed. But she declined it all with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We've got it covered, Mother. Daniel's parents are contributing plenty. And so I watched, from a polite distance, as my daughter planned the biggest day of her life without a single thread tied back to me. The first time I saw the venue, I had to blink twice to take it all in. An old sugarcane estate turned wedding retreat, marble fountains, grand verandas, and lighting strung like stars across every column and crepe myrtle. Lydia had chosen well. It was elegant, sweeping, and entirely foreign to me. Not the kind of place we'd ever visited growing up, let alone dreamed of renting. But Daniel's parents had money and opinions, and Lydia had developed a taste for both. I stood on the edge of the rehearsal dinner, hands clasped, feeling like a guest at someone else's life. Her dress fitting had happened in Manhattan. The registry was at places I'd never heard of, and when I offered her my mother's wedding veil, lace hand-stitched in 1924, she wrinkled her nose. That's sweet, Mama, but I've already picked one out. More modern. I nodded and folded it back into tissue paper. I told myself it didn't matter. That it was her day, not mine. That love is letting go of your own vision long enough to honor someone else's. But still, I caught myself holding my breath every time she looked at me, waiting for something. A glimmer. A thank you. A sign that, underneath the layers of silk and strategy, I was still her mother. And then came the wedding day. Hot as judgment, that morning. The kind of Carolina heat that makes your spine damp before breakfast. The garden ceremony began just before dusk, with Lydia glowing in a dress that cost more than my first car. She looked breathtaking. Truly. For a moment, the years melted and I saw her as she was at 5, running through the sprinkler, arms outstretched, wild with joy. The ceremony passed in a blur of tears and flashbulbs. And then came the reception. Toasts were made. Daniel's mother gave a speech full of veiled jabs. How proud they were of Lydia becoming a real woman, independent in every way. The band played smooth jazz, and I tried not to wince when they skipped our family waltz. And then late in the evening, I found her alone under the canopy of lights, eyes glassy with champagne and something sharper. That's when I offered the bracelet. 3 generations of women had worn it on their wedding day. A delicate chain of seed pearls and 1 rose gold clasp, soft, understated, precious. I held it out, wrapped in blue linen, hand trembling ever so slightly. She glanced at it, then at me. I don't need your pity gift, Mother, she said, voice low but laced with ice. You gave Daniel's parents credit in the program. You gave them respect. You gave them something. You gave me nothing. I blinked. What are you talking about, baby? And that's when she said it. Thanks for nothing. Then she turned and walked away, veil sweeping the dirt behind her like a storm cloud. I stood there, invisible in my own daughter's joy, No one noticed the bracelet fall from my hand. No one saw me kneel to pick it up. Just the sound of applause from the dance floor and the ache of a silence I'd carried for too long. The truth is, she wasn't wrong to feel something. But what she didn't understand, what she couldn't understand, was everything I had been protecting her from, including herself. I watched her disappear into the crowd, wondering if she'd ever see me again for who I really was. A mother, a widow, and the keeper of a $40 million secret I never asked to bear. 2 weeks passed before I heard anything at all. Not a text, not a voicemail, not even a forwarded wedding photo. The house was quieter than usual, even with Muffin's occasional protest from the windowsill. I spent my days tending roses, rereading old journal entries, and trying not to check the mailbox too early, as if it might carry some apology written in lavender ink. Instead, what arrived was a letter. Thick envelope, no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Lydia's. Inside, it wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a note. Just a copy of a prenuptial agreement. Highlighted in green were several lines about inheritance and trusts. Below that, a sticky note. Thought you should know what Daniel's parents expect of me. I guess we all have secrets.
No greeting. No closing. No worms.
I sat down hard on the edge of the bed. The air knocked right out of me. I wasn't shocked by the prenup. The Montclairs, Daniel's people, were old money from Connecticut, the kind who believed fortune could only flow in straight lines. But Lydia's tone, the undercurrent of accusation, it stung deeper than anything she'd said aloud that day under the wedding lights. That night, I opened Thomas's old file box. Inside were the original estate documents, notarized letters, and his handwritten notes. The man had prepared for everything, right down to a sealed letter addressed to Lydia. To be opened on your 35th birthday, it read. I ran my fingers over the wax seal. She was 31. 4 years away from the truth he'd wanted her to know, and I wasn't sure she'd wait. I poured myself a small bourbon and sat on the porch as the cicadas started their hymn. The sun dropped behind the marsh, and I began to question everything. Had I made a mistake by staying silent? Thomas had trusted me. But trust is a heavy thing to hold when it sits between a mother and daughter like a locked door. The next morning I called Lydia. She didn't answer. But a text arrived an hour later. I'm not ready to talk. You made your choice. So did I. And that was that. Until Daniel showed up. Not a call. Not a warning. Just the sight of his BMW in my driveway the following Saturday morning. He stepped out wearing a linen suit and a smile that was too smooth for 8 a.m. Mrs. Whitford, he said. I hope I'm not intruding. I smiled with all the steel I could muster. That depends. He nodded like he expected that. May I come in? It's about Lydia. Something in me bristled. Not because I feared him, but because I already knew this wasn't a visit of goodwill. He stepped into my foyer with the kind of casual confidence men like him carry from birth. Polished shoes on old pine floors, hands in his pockets like he owned the moment. Nice place, Daniel said, glancing around as if assessing its value rather than admiring its charm. Built in 1897, I replied, walking past him toward the sitting room. Still holding up better than most people I know. He chuckled, the sound tight. That's Charleston for you. I gestured to the settee, but he chose the armchair across from it. The one Thomas used to sit in with the paper folded just so. I didn't like him in that chair, but I said nothing. I'll get to the point, Daniel began, folding his hands like a man about to deliver a merger proposal. Lydia's hurt, confused, and frankly I am too. I nodded, letting him talk. She feels shut out, like there's a whole world of family wealth and legacy that's been deliberately kept from her. And from me as her partner. There it was. Not grief, not understanding, but access. He wanted the gate opened. I sipped my tea and set it down. Lydia was informed about the trust. She chose not to accept my offer to discuss it further. She told me, but you have to understand from our perspective it feels punitive. Punitive. I repeated, the word sour in my mouth. She's not being punished. She's being protected. He tilted his head. From what? From being treated like an adult? From knowing the truth about her inheritance? I held his gaze. From people who might see $40 million and forget to see the woman behind it. He flinched, just barely, but I caught it. A hairline crack in the marble. I'm not your enemy, Mrs. Whitford, he said softly. I love Lydia. I want her to feel empowered, not manipulated. I leaned back in Thomas's old rocking chair, the creak familiar grounding. Then maybe remind her that power isn't always given in the form of a check. We sat in silence for a long moment, the ticking clock the only sound between us. He rose, smoothing his sleeves. She's planning to start IVF soon. It's expensive. Insurance won't cover most of it. I looked up at him, truly looked. There was a hint of worry there, under all that polish. Maybe even love. But also expectation. Entitlement dressed as earnestness. I stood to. Tell Lydia, I said gently, that if she wants to talk to me, she knows where to find me. But I won't be triangulated. Not by legal documents. And certainly not by men who marry into this family thinking they've married into it. His jaw twitched, but he nodded. Fair enough. He walked to the door. Just before he left, he turned and added, You know, she still wears your locket. The one with the pressed gardenia. She hides it under her blouses like a secret. Then he was gone. I stood there a while, hand resting on the doorframe, heart heavier than before. Because now it wasn't just silence between Lydia and me. It was a war of truths, one spoken, one sealed. And neither of us willing to be the first to open the envelope. The summer deepened like a bruise, hot, purple-edged, and slow to heal. I kept to my routines. I pruned the roses with more care than necessary. I brought peach preserves to the church potluck and played Ella Fitzgerald on Sunday afternoons like Thomas used to. But something inside me was shifting. The silence between Lydia and me wasn't just an absence anymore. It had become an occupation, a quiet war across no man's land. I didn't hear from her after Daniel's visit. Not directly, but 3 weeks later a package arrived. No note, just a plain padded envelope with my address scrawled in Lydia's rushed hand. Inside was the locket, the one she'd worn since she was 12. The clasp was broken, barely holding together. The little gardenia petal inside had browned with age, but still it was hers. Ours. A keepsake of a simpler time. And now she'd sent it back like a returned gift. I sat down at the kitchen table and cried. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. Just quiet tears slipping into my coffee cup. The kind you don't wipe away because they belong to no one else. She was pulling away. Not just in anger but with finality. Like she'd decided I was no longer part of her new life. And this little broken chain was the last thread severed. Later that day, I finally did what I had resisted for so long. I drove to the bank. The manager, a sweet girl named Darla who always wore mauve lipstick, greeted me with a smile that faltered the moment she saw my face. Mrs. Whitford, are you all right? I nodded, lying out of habit. Just need access to box 312. Inside the safety deposit box were a handful of things. Thomas's final will, our wedding bands, the deed to the Edisto property, and the sealed letter meant for Lydia's 35th birthday. I stared at it for a long time, then slipped it into my purse. That night, I sat at the dining room table under the hum of the old chandelier. Hands trembling, envelope unopened. It wasn't mine to read, but it was mine to deliver. And after what Lydia had done, returning the locket, sending Daniel like a courier of guilt, I no longer believed time would heal what had broken between us. It was time she knew the truth. All of it. Even if it meant losing her for good. I didn't drive straight to Lydia's. I couldn't. Instead, I took the long way down Ashley River Road, past moss-draped trees and sleepy pastures, past the white clapboard church where she was baptized, past the now empty shell of the nursery where we used to buy marigolds together. The sun was low, painting everything in gold and shadow. It felt like a confession, just being out on the road with that envelope in my purse. When I finally pulled into her neighborhood, one of those pristine, planned communities with symmetrical hedges and houses named after birds, my heart thumped so loud I thought it might echo through the car. Her porch light was on. I rang the bell with my knuckle like I used to when she was little, a kind of Morse code between us. One short, one long. But it wasn't Lydia who answered. It was Daniel. He opened the door halfway, brow furrowed in surprise. Mrs. Whitford, we weren't expecting you. I know, I said, stepping past him gently. But sometimes what's unexpected is also what's needed. Lydia stood in the kitchen in sweatpants and a loose t-shirt, her hair pinned up, face bare. She looked younger, tired and stunned, like she'd been caught between two lives. Her eyes flicked to my purse. Is that? I nodded, pulling out the envelope. I brought you your father's letter. She didn't move, just stared at it like it might burn her hand. It was meant for your 35th, I said quietly. But I think he would have wanted you to read it now. She didn't take it. I'm not here to beg, I added. And I'm not here to defend myself. I just need you to know, your father's decision wasn't about distrust. It was about timing. He wanted you to be ready, and he trusted me to know when you were. Her mouth pressed into a line. And you think now I'm ready? No, I said. I think you've been ready for a while. I just didn't want to lose you in the process. That's when she broke. It wasn't dramatic, just a single sharp inhale. Then she walked past me slowly and sat at the kitchen table without saying a word. I placed the letter in front of her. She didn't open it, just ran her fingers over the seal like it might speak without being broken. Daniel, she said softly, can you give us a minute? He hesitated, just long enough to make me wonder what he'd say, then nodded and disappeared upstairs. Lydia looked up at me, her eyes rimmed with hurt. You made me feel like a stranger. I nodded, tears welling. I know. I thought you didn't believe in me, that you thought I'd ruin whatever he left behind.
No, he whispered.
I was just afraid you'd lose yourself trying to live up to it. She opened the letter, and as she read, her hands trembled. A few lines in, her lips parted. At the halfway mark, she let out a sob so quiet it felt like a breeze through the room. When she finished, she looked at me, not with anger but with something softer, sadder. I didn't know, she said. I know, baby. She held the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. He still believed in me. Always, I whispered. So have I. The silence that followed was the first that didn't hurt. It was just quiet, and full of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. You can always tell when a storm is coming in Charleston, not by the thunder but by the way the air changes. Thicker. Still. Like the whole world is holding its breath. That's how it felt between Lydia and me in the days that followed. She didn't call. I didn't press. But the letter had opened something. A door creaked inward, not all the way, but enough to let in a sliver of light. And yet, I knew, that kind of light has a way of revealing more than just comfort. It shows the dust, the cracks. And then one morning the call came. She was crying, breathless. I need you, she said. I was already grabbing my keys. I'm on my way. When I arrived, Daniel was gone. The house was too quiet, and Lydia was sitting on the floor beside the couch, legs pulled to her chest, an ultrasound photo clenched in her fist. I lost it, she whispered. I sank down beside her, not asking questions, just wrapping my arms around her like I used to when she scraped her knees. We rocked slowly in silence, her breath hiccuping against my shoulder. It was her third round of IVF, the one they said had the strongest markers. She'd waited weeks before telling anyone, even Daniel, because she couldn't bear to hope out loud. I didn't even get to be a mother, she choked out. I held her tighter. Oh, my sweet girl. You already are. You've loved something more than yourself. That's what mothering begins with. She sobbed harder. The next few hours were a blur. Tea poured and untouched, words shared between silences, and the fragile reweaving of something between us. Not repair, not yet. But closeness. Real raw closeness. Then she said it. Daniel wants me to ask you for the money. I didn't move. For another round? She shook her head, eyes fixed on the carpet. For a house. A bigger one. Somewhere new. He says it'll help us reset. I waited. But I don't want to move, she continued. I want to stay here. I want to grieve this baby in my own way. But he thinks this whole thing is holding us back. I exhaled slowly. And what do you think? She looked at me, truly looked. I think maybe I married a man who loves the idea of a family more than the truth of one. And there it was. The storm. Not mine. Hers. Her voice cracked as she went on. He said if I don't talk to you about releasing part of the trust now, he'll do it himself, that he has legal options. He says it's my responsibility to secure our future. I stood up then, not in anger but in something deeper. Resolve. Come with me, I said. She followed without question. We drove down to the attorney's office, the same one that handled Thomas's estate. Lydia sat beside me in that too-cold conference room, shoulders stiff, hands clenched in her lap. When the lawyer asked what we needed, I said simply, I'd like to amend the trust. Lydia turned to me, eyes wide. Mama. But I held up a hand. I want her to have the house. Any house. Free and clear. But not for him. Not for status. For her. And I want the remainder of the trust kept intact. Not as punishment but protection. If the marriage lasts, they'll benefit from it together. But if it doesn't, the lawyer nodded solemnly. We can structure that. Tears slipped down Lydia's cheek. You do that even now? I reached over and squeezed her hand. My dear, I said, I'll always protect you, even when you don't know you need protecting. She cried then freely in front of strangers. And for the first time in a long time, I knew she saw me not as a barrier, but as her mother. The legal process moved fast, not because of the money, but because I was clear. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't weighing guilt or grief. I was making a choice as a mother, not a martyr. And that clarity seemed to part every bureaucratic sea in our path. Lydia chose a small cottage-style home back in the city, not far from her old apartment. White shutters, a swing on the porch, and a backyard framed by crepe myrtles. It wasn't grand, but it felt rooted. Like her. She moved in without Daniel. That was the next rupture, the one we'd both seen coming, even if we hadn't said it aloud. He showed up on her doorstep 2 days after the papers were finalized. I wasn't there, but Lydia called me afterward, voice calm and steady. He accused me of letting you manipulate me, she said. I could hear the wind on her end, maybe the creak of that new porch swing. He said he couldn't be with someone who'd choose her mother over her marriage. My breath caught. And what did you say? She was quiet for a beat. Then, I told him I didn't choose between you and him. I chose myself. And you're part of that. I closed my eyes. My girl. Later that week, I brought over a potted rose bush, Zephyrine Drauhin of course, and helped her dig a hole near the back steps. She wore her old college sweatshirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, the same way Thomas used to when planting vegetables. Do you think Daddy would have liked this place? She asked, brushing dirt from her hands. He'd have loved it, I said. Especially the swing. He always wanted one. She smiled, then turned serious. There's something I didn't tell you. I looked at her, heart skipping. I read the letter again, she said, voice low. Not just the part where he said he trusted you, but the part where he told me not to rush becoming who I thought I had to be. That hit me hard. I nodded. He saw you clearer than you think. She stood up then, wiped her palms on her jeans and said, I'm going to try again. For the baby. But this time I'm going to do it alone. On my terms. Not as someone's wife. Not as a project. Just me. Tears welled in my eyes. You won't be alone. She smiled and leaned in, her forehead touching mine the way she used to as a child when neither of us had the words for our love. The breaking point had come and gone, not as a rupture to fear, but as a necessary crack in the shell that had kept us from seeing each other clearly. And from that crack, something unexpected had begun to bloom. Grief doesn't always leave when you ask it to. It lingers. Not as loud sobs or broken glass, but as soft echoes in the quiet moments. And in the weeks after Lydia made her choice, our lives were filled with those moments. I'd never seen her so still. She'd always been a mover, a planner, a list maker. Even as a little girl, she'd draw up schedules for imaginary tea parties, color-coded by napkin. But now she sat on that porch swing most mornings with a cup of chamomile and silence. Sometimes I joined her. Sometimes she needed the stillness alone. The house had become her sanctuary, but sanctuaries aren't always peaceful. They're just safe places to bleed in private. Daniel didn't fight the separation. He returned to Connecticut within a month, citing irreconcilable emotional divergence in the divorce papers. I had to laugh at that. It sounded more like a business memo than a farewell. Lydia signed them quietly and mailed them back without ceremony. But endings, even clean ones, leave residue. One night, I found her in the guest room, curled up with a photo album from her wedding, the one she never finished. She looked up at me, her face bare, cheeks pink from quiet weeping. "I feel like I failed," she whispered. I sat beside her and pulled her close. "You didn't fail. You ended something that wasn't growing. That's not failure, my dear. That's gardening." She gave a soft laugh, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. But it was a start. We spent more time together than we had in years. She came with me to the farmer's market, helped me reorganize Thomas's books, even began tending a little herb patch behind her kitchen. There was a slowness to her grief. Not numb, not despairing, just slow. Like healing that wasn't in a rush to arrive, but wasn't lost either. And then, one evening, I came over and found her in the doorway holding a small white envelope. The fertility clinic had sent her latest test results. She opened it while I sat beside her, both of us bracing for whatever would come next. She read silently, lips moving. Then she set the letter down and exhaled. "I'm a candidate. Still viable." I smiled. "Then the door's still open." She nodded. "I think. I want to walk through it." A pause. "But I don't want to do it alone, Mama. Not just the procedure. The whole thing. I want my child to know who we are. Our story. Our history." I reached for her hand. "Then let's begin again." We didn't announce it. There were no dramatic declarations or Instagram posts or pink and blue balloon nonsense. It was just Lydia and me, walking slowly into a new season of our lives, with cautious hearts, a handful of savings, and hope planted like bulbs waiting for spring. She started the next round of IVF that fall. I went with her to every appointment, sat in the waiting room with a thermos of spiced tea and a mystery novel in my lap, pretending to read while counting the seconds between smiles and sighs. She was different this time, gentler with herself. No longer chasing perfection, just presence. There were hard days. Hormones took their toll. She'd cry sometimes for no reason, sometimes for every reason. And I'd sit with her, brush her hair back from her damp temples, and say the only thing I knew to be true. We're not alone in this. Not now. Sometimes she'd fall asleep on the couch with her head in my lap, the television flickering quietly in the background. I'd look down at her, this grown woman who once needed me to tie her shoes, and I'd feel something like grace. One day, she asked if I still had Thomas's voice recordings. I blinked. "You remember those?" She nodded. "He used to record bedtime stories when he traveled. I remember one about a bear who built a house out of honey." I laughed. "Oh Lord, yes. Benedict the busy bear." We spent that evening in my attic, sifting through old tapes and CDs, until we found one labeled in Thomas's handwriting. For LYD, age 8 goodnight stories. We listened together, sitting on the floor in dust and memory. His voice, rich and warm, filled the room. "And remember, baby girl, the bravest people aren't the ones who fight dragons. They're the ones who love when it's hard." Lydia covered her face with both hands and wept. I wrapped my arms around her and let the past carry us forward. By winter, she was pregnant. We didn't throw a party. Just lit a candle by Thomas's photograph and sat together, hands joined, while the wind rattled the windows and the rose bush outside trembled in its sleep. "Do you think he knows?" she whispered. I squeezed her hand. "I think he never stopped believing you'd come home. And now, my dear, you are." Pregnancy has a way of turning time inside out. The body slows. The hours stretch. Even the air feels thicker, like the world is holding its breath for something delicate to take root. And for Lydia, it wasn't just her body changing, it was everything. She began to journal. Not the kind of clipped, efficient notes she'd kept in her planners for years. No, this was different. Flowing ink, curling letters, pages full of vulnerability and memory. She wrote letters to the baby, even before she knew if it would be a boy or a girl, about who she had been, who she hoped to become, and the long road between. I read one once accidentally. She'd left it open on the kitchen counter, and my eyes caught the first line. "Your grandmother saved me before you ever arrived." I closed the journal gently, heart aching with something I hadn't dared hope for in years. Understanding. She started asking more about Thomas too. What was Daddy afraid of? She asked one evening as we folded tiny onesies in her living room. Losing time, I said after a moment. He always felt like he was running behind. Not with work, but with love. He wanted to give more than life allowed. She nodded. That's how I feel now. Like I wasted so much time not knowing what mattered. I looked at her. Cheeks softening with pregnancy, hair tied up messily like mine used to be when she was little. And I said, you didn't waste it. You lived it. And sometimes living it wrong is how we learn to live it right. She cried then. Not out of sadness, but release. There was a new piece to her grief. Not because it vanished, but because she stopped resisting it. Grief, joy, fear, hope. It all swirled inside her like the early movements of life that now stirred beneath her ribs. And I saw myself in her more every day. Not the version of me she'd once resisted, the cautious, traditional woman she thought she had to outgrow, but the woman underneath. The one who chose silence not out of weakness, but love. The one who knew when to wait, and when to let go. One night, near the end of her second trimester, she curled up beside me on the couch and whispered, I'm scared. I brushed her hair back. Of what? Of doing it alone. Of repeating the same mistakes. I shook my head. You won't. Because you're not her, and you're not me. You're you. And that's more than enough. She rested her head on my shoulder. I'm naming her Rose, she whispered. My breath caught. After the garden? After all the women who kept growing, even with thorns. The third trimester came like a southern storm. All at once and full of trembling. Lydia moved slower. She stopped answering work emails. Her days became soft rituals. Tea in the morning, a walk around the block, an afternoon nap with muffin curled up against her belly like a sentry. She began to nest, not in a frenzy, but gently, folding blankets, rearranging bookshelves, humming to herself as she dusted the nursery with a feather cloth that had once belonged to my mother. There was a kind of holiness to it. But there were quiet fears too. Some nights I'd find her awake, sitting in the nursery rocking chair with her eyes fixed on the moonlight spilling through the curtains. She'd glance at me and whisper, I don't know if I can be both a mother and myself. And I'd tell her the truth. You won't be. You'll become something new. Something braver. Something softer and stronger all at once. She smiled at that sometimes. Other times she just nodded and let me rub her shoulders in silence. The days turned inward. The past no longer stung the way it used to. It just shimmered in the background, like a film of memory coating everything we touched. She asked more about my miscarriages, about what Thomas was like in the delivery room, about what I'd feared most when I became her mother. Losing myself, I said. And I did. But what I found in place of it was so much more. She held my hand when I said that. She didn't flinch the way she used to when I talked about pain. One morning we sat on the porch swing. The air sweet with the first breath of spring. The Zephyrine Drauhen bush had bloomed again, thick and bright and unapologetically pink. Lydia leaned back and sighed. I'm not angry anymore. I turned to her. At Daniel. At you. At myself. I was for so long and I didn't even know why. I thought it was about the money. Or control. But really it was about not knowing who I was outside of what people expected of me. I nodded. That's the loneliest kind of anger. She looked at me then, not as the woman she'd once judged or feared, but as someone she finally understood. I'm glad you didn't give me the money, she said softly. Not then. And I smiled. You're not the only one who's changed. Because my dear I had. Not all at once. Not in some thunderclap of awakening. But slowly. Gracefully. Like old wood warming in sunlight. I stopped needing to be the silent one. I began to speak when I needed to show up, not just with casseroles and calm, but with truth. And in that stillness, in the quiet turning inward of both our hearts, something bloomed we hadn't dared hope for. Forgiveness. Lydia went into labor on a Friday morning, just as the mockingbirds began their chorus. The call came at 4:12 a.m. Mama, she said, her voice thin but certain. It's time. The drive to the hospital felt like a dream stitched from every memory I'd ever held. Her first breath, her first steps, the first time she said I hate you as a teenager, and now this. She was already dilated to 6 centimeters when I got there. Hair tied back, face glistening, a quiet intensity in her gaze. The nurses moved around her with calm precision, and she met every moment with a kind of trembling grace. She wanted me in the room. I need you, she said simply, without pride or performance. And so I held her hand, breathed with her, whispered stories into her ear between contractions, of her father's corny jokes, of the way she used to sleep with her hand tucked under my chin, of the first time she smiled in her sleep and how I'd stayed up the whole night watching her. Hours passed. The sun rose. The world spun. And then, in the small stillness of late afternoon, Rose entered the world. Tiny. Wrinkled. Angry as a thundercloud. Perfect. Lydia cried as they placed the baby on her chest. Not with fear. Not with exhaustion. But with the kind of joy that breaks you open. She's here, she whispered. Mama, she's here. I rested my hand on both of them, daughter and granddaughter, and felt a circle close gently around us. Not perfectly, not without scars, but whole, in the way only truth and time can make a thing whole. In the days that followed, something shifted in Lydia. She became quieter, but not withdrawn, just deeper. Every movement seemed to carry intention. Every word was chosen with care. One morning, as we sat together with Rose asleep between us, she turned to me and said, I want to write a letter. I looked at her. To who? To her. Like Daddy did for me. I nodded. What will you say? She thought for a moment, then smiled. That I almost lost myself becoming her mother, and that it was the most beautiful thing that ever happened to me. I kissed her temple. Then she'll know who she comes from. We didn't speak of Daniel. He sent one email. A short, flat message of congratulations with no return address. Lydia read it once and deleted it. No viternis. No ceremony. Just done. The past no longer needed to be fought. It had been reckoned with. Spring settled over Charleston like a soft hymn. Azaleas bloomed in bursts of pink along the sidewalks. The air was thick with honeysuckle and the sweet ache of starting over. Lydia's house, once a quiet place of retreat, began to echo with laughter, lullabies, and the rhythmic creak of a rocking chair worn smooth by sleepless nights. Rose was a good baby. Strong lungs, curious eyes, a grip that could anchor your soul. But more than that, she seemed to know us, like some old spirit reborn with the wisdom of where she came from. Lydia glowed, but not in that romanticized way people talk about new mothers. She glowed like a woman who'd passed through fire and emerged holding her own heart intact. One afternoon, as we folded laundry together, she said, I've been thinking about what happens when Rose turns 35. I looked up from a pile of onesies, curious. I want her to have the option to read the letter early too, like I did. But I also want her to know why it was sealed in the first place. I want her to understand that waiting doesn't mean withholding, that some things bloom better with time. I felt a swell of pride. She'll know, I said, because you'll show her. Lydia smiled. I already am. That weekend we buried Thomas's ashes beneath the rose bush. It was something we'd put off, not out of avoidance but reverence. Lydia wanted Rose to be here for it. Even if she couldn't remember it, we could tell her one day that her grandfather, who never got to meet her, now bloomed every spring outside her window. We said a few words, nothing grand, just truth. He believed in things he couldn't always see, Lydia whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Like this garden. Like me. And I added softly, like us. We stood there a long while, the breeze teasing our hair. Rose cradled against Lydia's chest in a sling stitched from her old baby blanket. 3 generations of women, quiet in the presence of a man who had loved them in his quiet way. Fiercely, enduringly, and with more trust than words could hold. Afterward, Lydia handed me an envelope. What's this? I asked. A letter. For you. I opened it slowly. Inside, in her handwriting, were just a few lines. You saved me without saying a word. But your silence spoke volumes. This is me speaking back. And beneath that, a drawing, clumsy, sweet, of a rose bush. 2 flowers fully open. One still in bud. I pressed the paper to my chest and wept. Because this was the climb. the slow ascent back into each other's lives. And standing there, with my daughter beside me and my granddaughter in her arms, I realized something simple and true. Some reckonings don't tear us apart. They reveal what was strong enough to survive all along. The year after Rose was born passed like pages in a book too beloved to rush. Lydia settled into motherhood with a grace that made me ache. Not because it looked easy, it wasn't. But because it looked honest. She let herself cry when the baby wouldn't sleep. She laughed when Rose spit up on her brand new blouse. And when she caught sight of herself in the mirror one morning, hair unbrushed, shirt stained, eyes puffy with sleep, she didn't flinch. She smiled. "I like her," she said, brushing a hand over her reflection. "She's messy and strong and real." And my dear, I could have kissed the heavens for that moment. She went back to work part-time, remote mostly, with Rose snoozing in a bassinet beside her desk. She started writing, too real writing. Essays about identity and motherhood and money and silence. One of them got published in a regional magazine, under her own name. The title? Inheritance Isn't Always a Check. I cut out the page and framed it. We still had our quiet days. Days where the past tugged at her sleeve. Where Daniel's shadow crept back in through a news article or a mutual friend's mention. But she didn't unravel. She'd simply look at Rose, then at me and say, "We're okay." Because we were. One evening, just after Rose took her first wobbly steps across the living room rug, Lydia looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "She walked to you," she whispered. I scooped Rose into my arms, heart bursting. Of course she did. She knows where strength lives. Lydia sat down beside me and took my hand. "I used to think you owed me more," she said quietly. "More openness. More explanation. More trust. But now I realize I wasn't ready to carry it when you were carrying me." I didn't speak. I just pulled her in and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair and the warm innocence of Rose pressed between us. Because, my dear, that's what resolution is. It's not a finish line. It's the soft landing of truth, the return to love not as we imagined it, but as it really is, scarred, strong, and worth the climb. We celebrated Rose's first birthday under the same oaks where Lydia once toddled through clover in her Sunday best. It was a simple gathering: homemade lemonade, a carrot cake with cream cheese frosting, and a handful of close friends who had walked with us through the storm.
No balloons.
No bounce house. Just love threaded between generations like heirloom lace. Lydia wore the bracelet, the one she'd refused on her wedding day. It glistened on her wrist as she lifted Rose onto her hip, her laughter rising like birdsong through the late spring air. She caught me watching and smiled. "I'm ready to carry it now," she said. "Not just the bracelet. The story." And oh my heart. After the guests left and the dishes were stacked, we sat together on the porch, watching fireflies flicker in the tall grass. Lydia rocked gently with Rose asleep against her chest, her thumb tracing slow circles across the baby's back. "She's going to know everything," she said. "About you. About Daddy. About what silence costs and what it saves." I nodded. "She'll be stronger for it." "She already is," Lydia whispered. A soft breeze stirred the chimes. Somewhere down the block, a screen door creaked. The world felt settled. Not in the sense of being finished, but in being whole. She turned to me again. "There's something I need to say. I never thanked you. Not just for the money, or the patience, or the rose bush. But for loving me even when I was unlovable." I shook my head gently. "You were never unlovable, baby. Just hurting." She leaned over and rested her head on my shoulder. "Still, thank you." I kissed her forehead. "You don't have to thank me for being your mother. That's the one thing in this life I never doubted." And with that we sat in peace. No more secrets. No more blame. Just two women, mother and daughter, wrapped in the warm hush of a truth finally told, and a love finally understood. Now and then, when the light is just right in the late afternoon, slanting through the kitchen windows in long golden ribbons, I find myself back in that moment. Lydia, with her feet tucked under her on the swing. Rose, babbling nonsense that only a grandmother can translate. And me, shelling peas while jazz hums softly in the background, feeling the hush of a life reclaimed. Sometimes we sit in silence. Other times, Lydia reads aloud from her latest piece, Always in progress, always brave. Rose claps even when the words don't rhyme. That baby's applause could cure most heartaches, I swear. The 40 million? Still intact, mostly. We created something new. A family endowment of sorts. Not for luxuries, but for legacy. Lydia named it the Whitford Fund, in her father's honor. It helps single mothers start over. Helps young women finish school. Helps families caught in the riptide of silence and grief. It's not charity. It's reclamation. And in that, my dear, I've found more meaning than any dollar ever could hold. Lydia still wears the bracelet. On Rose's second birthday, she added a tiny charm to it, a rosebud etched in gold. Every generation adds something, she said. I just smiled. Because we do, don't we? We add our sorrows, our stumbles, our stubbornness. But we also add grace, forgiveness, the quiet courage to speak the truth, even if our voices shake. So if you see a woman walking the cobblestone streets of Charleston with a toddler in her arms and a grandmother at her side, know this. There's a story there. Of money and misunderstandings. Of silence and storms. But most of all, of love, not always loud, but always lasting. If at my daughter's wedding, she said thanks for nothing, I stayed silent about the $40 million her father left me. Open something quiet in your soul. My dear, I'd love to know what stayed with you. Leave me a note below. Share it with someone who might be walking the same road. And subscribe if you'd like to sit for another tale one day soon. Some stories take time to bloom. Thank you for keeping me company.